and then we'll get to the Kabbalistic perspective. But the premise here is that Sedom, it seems that the Torah is fascinated by Sedom. It's the wicked city. It was destroyed. It was in some ways the antithesis of Abraham, right? You have Abraham is the epitome of kindness. And in Abraham's life, you have the hero, and then you have the, what do they call it? The opposite of the hero. There must be a word in literature for that. So Abraham is the hero. He's the epitome of kindness. And then you have Sedom, which is the city and the society, which is the antithesis, in the sense that not only do they not encourage kindness, but where kindness is literally against the law, as the Medrash explains and brings all the stories, where they would kill people who would support the guests. And the story itself tells you the biblical story tells you that they wanted to kill the guests that came to town. But the Torah gives us insight into the story of Sedom, last week's parsha, where there's the battle between the 4 kings and the 5 kings, and ultimately Avram comes and rescues the city of Sedom. And then once again in this week's parsha, we read about the destruction of Sedom, and prior to the destruction of Abraham's descent, Abraham's trying to ask God to forgive the city of Sedom. And it takes up too many verses to just say, well, it's just a technical story. So from the Kabbalistic perspective, there has to be meaning here, and there has to be something in Sedom that is actually positive. And that's why the tragedy of Sedom is that the positive aspect of Sedom could not express itself, at least not yet, and only later in history will Sedom emerge and be corrected. So this idea comes from the Medrash. The Medrash says as follows: there's a psalm in the book of Psalms, King David's book of Psalms, in Psalm number 89, and there it gives us the history of how David is singing how God chose the house of David, in other words, the tribe of Judah, the house of David, and promised to protect and support the house of David, etc. Very beautiful psalm. And the end of the psalm, it turns turns into a lamentation, how despite all the promises, nevertheless, the house of David was destroyed with the destruction of the temple, etc., etc. So it's a very beautiful and moving psalm. But in the first half of the psalm, where it discusses how God reaches out and chooses the house of David and gives David and his descendants all the great promises. So there's a verse. The verse says, Matzati David Avdi. I found my servant David. Now, what does it mean, I found my servant David? So typically when you say I found, you mean it was unexpected, right? So when you find something that's unexpected, if you're working for your boss and your boss gives you a check at the end of the week, you didn't find your paycheck, right? You earned your paycheck. To say I found, it means it was unexpected. So what does it mean that God found David? And he found it meaning it was unexpected. So the simple interpretation, I guess, is that if you read the story in the book of Samuel, nobody expected David to be the king. In other words, David was the youngest of his brothers. His brothers were much more handsome, much more good looking. And when Samuel was sent by God to anoint one of the children of Yishai, of Jesse, of Yishai in English, Yishai in Hebrew, to appoint him as a king, first they present him the oldest son, and Samuel says, wow, beautiful, this guy is handsome, he can be the king. And God says, no, man can only see with the eyes, but God sees the soul. And it's not the first one, it's not the second one. They go through all the children, and there's no king. God doesn't tell Samuel this is not the one. And finally, Jesse says, oh yeah, I have one more son. He's out in the field. He's with the sheep. And they bring him in, and he's redheaded, which at that point was not seen as appropriate for leadership. And they bring him in, and he's the one that God chooses. So that could be the simple meaning of Matzati. I found, if it was unexpected, nobody expected David of all his family, even if somebody in the family is going to be chosen to be the king, nobody expected it to be David. Fine, that's the simple meaning. Comes the Medrash, and the Medrash says something fascinating. Matzati David Avdi, I found David, my servant. Says the Medrash, where did I find him? Where did I find David? And the answer is, I found him in Sedom. David comes from the wicked city of Sedom. How does that happen? How does David come from the wicked city of Sedom? Well, the answer is, of course, that in this week's parsha we read that after the destruction of Sedom, you have Lot, who was Abraham's nephew, who lived in Sedom and was rescued by the two angels with his two daughters, rescued from the city of Sedom. So Lot is in his daughters with his daughters in a cave, and they think that all the people around were destroyed, and there'll be no more continuation to humanity. So they get their father drunk, and they become pregnant from their father. And the first daughter, they both become pregnant. The first one in 2 different nights. The first daughter names her son Moav, which means from my father, and the second one names her son Ammon. The bottom line is that Moav becomes a full nation. In other words, the son of the older daughter becomes a great nation, becomes a nation. Ammon, who lives east of the Jordan, in part of current day Jordan, and there Ammon becomes a nation. And then there's a woman, hundreds of years later, there's a woman, Ruth, who we studied about a few months ago. Ruth was the convert from Moab. So she's a Moabite, and she converts, eventually comes to Israel. The whole story, how because there was a family from Judea who left Judah because of the famine and came to Moab. Long story short, the bottom line is Ruth comes from Moab, and Ruth is the mother, the matriarch, in other words, the great-grandmother of King David. Okay, so what the Medrash says is King David comes from Sedom. King David comes from Sedom. What does King David represent? It's not just King David. It's the King David as the first king of Israel, but ultimately King David is the father of the kings of Israel, and ultimately the Mashiach, the Messiah, the one who's going to come and bring salvation to the entire world and peace and harmony to the entire world. So it actually stems from Sedom, which is very, very strange, because Sedom is the wicked people. They don't shear. And not only, like I said, not only they don't share, but they make giving illegal. And here you tell me that the salvation of the entire world through David, ultimately that will happen through the Messiah, through Mashiach, who's a descendant of David, that all stems from Sedom. How could that even be? So the Medrash makes the point, Matzati, David was found in Sedom, meaning it's unexpected. But what exactly is happening here, and how does this all play out? So this is the question that we want to address. So first we're going to address it from a political level and a psychological level, and then we'll get to the Kabbalistic level. So let's think about it just from a political level. In other words, from just the theories of philosophies of governance. And we want to think about how did Sedom develop? So again, Sedom is a city where not only they don't, a society, a city, it's really a region, but it's a society that discourages kindness. Not only they discourage kindness, but it's illegal to invite guests. It's illegal to support the poor. And how do you get there? Like how do you descend? How do you get, as a society, how do you come there? So the truth of the matter is that almost every philosophy begins with a positive kernel of truth. There's something true about this society. And the Hasidic commentaries point out that really the culture of Sedom does not emerge in a vacuum. The culture of Sedom emerges after the destruction of the Great Flood. In other words, when they set out to build their society in Sedom, they specifically want to correct and ensure that the society, the culture that led to the destruction of the flood should not reoccur. So what do I mean? What happens? What was the sin of the generation of the flood? So the verse says, Ki malaha haaretz chamas. The earth was full of robbery. In other words, people would steal from each other. And there's fascinating explanations in the Medrash. What does it mean people would steal from each other? they not only because they wanted the possessions of the other person, but because in general they were cruel. So there's an interesting example the Medrash says. So the Medrash would say that, let's say there's a person coming to sell grapes in the market. So the merchant comes with all his grapes. Now each person in the market would come and take one grape, and the merchant would lose all his grapes. The problem is you can't take anyone to court. Why? Because one grape is not a significant enough loss to sue. So what are you going to say? It's not even worth a penny. What's one grape worth? So what are you going to say? You're going to say, you're going to sue me? What did I take? I only took one grape. And that's how they would get away from punishment. In other words, this is a society that they were not stealing. Sometimes a person steals because he's hungry. I have no choice. I have to steal. This was or greed. This was just a stealing in order, just for the sake of stealing. I'm just getting one grape, but I want to rob you of what you have. And that's how society develops. Now, if you want to figure out, if you want to phrase that culture in a different way, you could say that culture, the culture of the generation of the flood, which ultimately led to the destruction of the world, because as we point out, God, when people sin against God, God will overlook. He may not punish, but he's not going to destroy the foundations of society. But when people cannot get along with each other, then the society has to be destroyed, because the whole purpose of society is for civilization, for people to be able to live together. But if people are not doing the basic morality, then society will fall apart. And that's what happens in the generation of the flood. And so in some sense, the people post the flood, how did they look back at the generation of the flood? So what they do is they look at it and they say, what do we have here? We have a society that has no respect for private property. That's what it is. So I have my grapes. I bring my grapes to town, and people don't respect my private property. So therefore, they stole from each other. So if you want to make sure that we don't once again deteriorate to a place of robbery and a place of a place of robbery, a place which ultimately would not allow people would cause God to intervene and once again destroy the earth, we need to protect private property. That was their society. So they go to a place, they go to the valley of the Jordan Valley. And before the Jordan Valley was overturned, the Torah says, Kigan Hashem Ke'eretz Mitzrayim, this was like the garden of God, like the land of Egypt. So we know in Egypt, it's in a desert, but the area around the area around the Nile River is very fertile, because the Nile provides water for agriculture. So the Torah says that the Valley of Sedom, which was by the Jordan Valley, was actually the closest place to Israel to be like Egypt. In other words, there's the Nile, and therefore there could be a lot of water and a lot of agriculture. So what happens here, there's tremendous amount of wealth. It's an area full of natural resources. So they create a society. They go to a place where there's natural resources, and they say, this is a society where everybody has what they need, and we respect private property. And therefore, they ultimately, what that leads to, they go to the other extreme, and they say shearing is illegal. How do you get to shearing is illegal? Because shearing is an assault on private property. What are you going to say? I have to support the poor? So you're saying the money is not mine. If you're saying the money is not mine, ultimately, what's stopping the poor from breaking into my house and taking the money? So they were traumatized by the mistake of the generation of the flood, which was basically a lack of respect for private property. And therefore they respond in the other extreme, and they say, if you tell me that I have to give charity, then that means that I don't really own my property. I don't really own my possessions. And they refuse to accept that. So to tighten and to strengthen the value of private property, they make shearing and inviting guests and giving to somebody else, they make it illegal. So they go to the other extreme. Now, there's a beautiful verse that explains God, before the verse says that God consults with Abraham and tells Abraham that he's about to destroy Sodom. So God justifies. Why does God have to speak to Abraham? Abraham is his lawyer, his accountant, his legal advisor. Why does God need to speak to Abraham? So the verse says verse explains the relationship between God and Abraham. So the verse says, Ki yadaitiv, I know Abraham, meaning I love him. The know is not just technical. I know about somebody, but it's really much more intimate. So God has a relationship with Abraham. Why? And this is the key. Because he commands his children and his household to do what? Tzedakah umishpat, to do just charity and justice. Charity and justice. Okay, what does charity and justice mean? Okay, so the commentaries explain as follows. They say that justice means the law. The law means that there is private property. There's no private property, there's no law. What are you going to say? I took your potato. The potato doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the collective. So when you say law represents private property, and tzedakah, charity, represents giving to the poor. Abraham had the perfect balance. What is the balance? The balance is, of course, not like Sedom that did not respect, not like the generation of the flood that did not respect private property, because that would be no justice. Abraham believes in justice. There'll be no justice. Abraham believes in justice. Abraham believes in private property. The possessions are yours. However, it's not just mishpat. He doesn't just do justice. Abraham also does tzedakah, charity. What does Abraham understand that the people of Sedom did not understand? That of course it's yours. But what charity is about is giving from what is yours to the other person. That's what charity is. Charity doesn't mean I'm giving it to you because you earned it or you deserve it. That's not what charity is. Charity is it's mine and I give it to you. In fact, if it's not mine and I give it to you, if you think it's not mine, I'm just giving it to you and it's not really mine, then there's no opportunity for kindness. What does kindness mean? Kindness means I don't have to give it to you. It's mine, and yet I give it to you. So that is ultimately true justice. True justice is, true charity is that you believe in private property. It belongs to me, and yet I, from my free will, choose to give it to you. So what I'm trying to say here is that the generation of the flood is one extreme. They don't believe in private property. The people of Sedom, they're trying to correct that. So they go to the other extreme and they say we believe in private property to the extreme. And therefore sharing with somebody else who doesn't earn it is a violation of private property, which is the foundation of our morals. And therefore they made it illegal. Abraham understands that Sedom, even though they're good intentioned, but in reality, sometimes you have a good theory, but in reality, it doesn't work. Think of communism. It's very, on the books, it looks really good. That's why so many Jews were attracted to it. But in reality, it doesn't work. And this philosophy of private property to the extreme, and we're not supporting anybody, in reality, what it does is it makes a cruel society. And therefore, the city has to be destroyed. However, this is going back to the point. But the truth of Sedom, there is some messianic element in Sedom. What do I mean? What is the Messianic era? Messianic era is nobody is going to need anybody else. There's going to be enough provisions for everybody. There will be no more poor. So there is a certain utopia that we believe will happen in the end of days. The problem is that Sedom wants to bring it about prematurely. So what they do is, because they don't want to have to share, what they're going to do is they say, you know what? We are going to make a sort of a gated community. We're gonna create an environment where we just have our people, and within our people, we will live the utopia of the Messianic era. That's what we want. So we're going to ignore the people outside of our gated city. And in our gated city, it's a wonderful existence like the Messianic era where nobody has any needs. And if nobody has any needs, there's no need to share. But to do that, the expense is we're going to keep everybody else out. And that's the fallacy of their philosophy. But ultimately, what they're saying is messianic, because what they're saying is we want the society where people are not going to be in need. And ultimately, that's going to be the position of the world in the messianic era. So therefore, now we look back at the Medrash and says, I found David in Sedom. Sedom is they're trying to tap in to the messianic era. They just did it prematurely, and therefore it's unhealthy, and therefore it's cruel. So all cruel societies begin with good intentions. Okay, so that is just from the angle of the sort of political philosophy of it. And if anybody has any questions or comments, I would love to hear. And then we'll move to the Kabbalistic angle of what is so holy and spiritual about Sedom, and if it was so holy and spiritual, and therefore it becomes the father, it becomes the source of the Messiah, because again, King David comes from Ruth, which comes from Moab, which is who's the son of the daughter of Lot, who was saved from the city of Sedom. So ultimately, the entire lineage of King David and ultimately the Messiah comes from Sedom. So if Sedom is so good, why was it indeed overturned? So what does the potential of Sedom represent, and how was it destroyed? So we gave the sort of the political analysis, and in a moment we'll move on to the Kabbalistic analysis. But in the meantime, if anybody has any comments or questions, please share.
How do you
Otherwise,
balance?
go ahead.
How do you balance the idea of even Abraham saying that there's personal property and you give from yourself, when with the idea of everything is from Hashem and nothing is ours?
Everything ultimately belongs to Hashem, but Hashem gives you the right to ownership, and therefore, and why does he give it to you? In order that you should take from what is yours and give to somebody else.
Okay.
That's how we look at charity. If you say, look, the Gemara, there's a famous story in the Talmud where one of the Roman generals or Caesars or kings, I don't remember, asks Rabbi Akiva. He says, I don't understand. He says, if God loves the poor, why doesn't he support the poor directly? In other words, he was asking, what's this business of Jews giving charity? Today, charity is popular, but throughout history, I said last week that every mitzvah in the Torah at some point people thought was not. In other words, every mitzvah in the Torah at some point was not in the fad. So today, charity is nice. Everyone wants to correct the world and give charity, but it wasn't always that way. And in the times of the Roman Empire, where what was celebrated was might and strength and power and dominance. So the whole idea of giving charity was like a weakness. You have compassion. You're weak. How are you going to take over the world with this amount of weakness? So the Roman asks Rabbi Akiva, if God loves the poor, why doesn't he support them directly? And Rabbi Akiva answers, you don't understand. He's giving us the opportunity. He gives us the money to give the poor, so that to give us the merit of feeding the poor. Okay. So Lisa's saying, 1 second, isn't that a contradiction to what we're saying about private property? But the answer is no, because if God gives it to us and we're just supposed to hold on to it and pass it on, then we're just a mailman. So we don't really get the merit. It's not really a mitzvah. The whole beauty here is it's God's. God gives it to you. Now you own it. Now God wants that you should take something that belongs to you and give it to somebody else. That's the whole beauty here, right? If you give me $1 and say, give it to the poor, that's not my mitzvah. I'm just a mailman. So that's the meaning of the words of Avraham, tzedakah mishpat, charity and justice. Charity and justice. That's the problem with socialism. What's the problem with socialism? In addition to the fact that it doesn't work, but what's the problem in philosophically speaking? Philosophically speaking, if you don't give people ownership, you're not letting people perform kindness. What is the whole world? One of the reasons why the world was created, it says in the Eitz Chaim, in the Kabbalistic writings of the Arizal, is because God is kind. So God creates the world, and the purpose of the world is to do kindness. So there is no kindness if I'm not giving from what is mine to you. If the collective owns everything and the collective gives everybody what they need, then you don't have a society where people perform kindness to each other. So to philosophically speaking, in other words, that if you think about this, essentially, kindness is only possible when you have ownership. If you have no ownership, if it's the kibbutz, if everybody owns everything and the collective gives me what I need and gives you what I need, it's wonderful. No, but we solve one problem. We solve the problem even theoretically in a small circle in the kibbutz in Israel, in a small circle in Sedom. You could solve the problem with nobody's in need. You can't do it for the rest of the world yet. That's the Messianic era. But you could theoretically create a small group where nobody needs anything, because everything belongs to the collective, and the collective, everybody and everybody and everyone gets what they need. The problem with that is that there is no kindness. Where is there kindness? Where is there? I'm giving to you what belongs to me. For that, you need mishpat. For that, you need law. For that, you need private property. And then you say, it's mine, and I give it to you. So the generation of the flood is one extreme. They don't believe in private property. The generation of Sedom the society of Sedom tried to correct it by going to the other extreme and saying that what? They're going to say that we believe in private property to the extreme, and therefore, if you shear, you're not just shearing a dollar, you're not just giving a poor person a plate of food. What you're really doing is you're undermining the whole basis for the morality of society. Because if you're giving to somebody else, it means you're weakening the institution of private property. And if you're weakening the institution of private property, ultimately we're going to deteriorate and become like the generation of the flood. So they outlaw shearing, because shearing is an attack. In their understanding, shearing is an assault on private property. In other words, giving to someone who is not deserving, that's an attack on private property. And the reality is we need both. The reality is we need to understand that there's tzedakah and there's mishpat. God gave it to you. Of course, everything belongs to God, but God gave it to me, and God gave it to me for ownership, and He expects me to take what is mine and give to somebody else. I just want to say that what is it? What did I want to say? Oh, there's the whole Rambam. I'm not going to go into it right now. But the Rambam explains, the Rambam says, basically there's a distinction between my life and my money. My life is God gives to me, and I don't have ownership on my life. From the perspective of Judaism, my life is not mine. I can't decide to terminate my life. I can't decide to commit suicide. My life was never given to me. My life is God's. But my possessions are given to me. And therefore my possessions, in other words, of course, it stems from God, and God is the ultimate ruler, but God gives us the permission to be able to, God gives us the ownership to be able to do whatever we want with those possessions. So there's a distinction, even though everything comes from God and ultimately everything belongs to God, but there's a difference between life, which is God retains the ownership for completely, and then possessions, which God says, you know what, I'm giving it to you, you own it. You own it in the sense that you can do whatever you want with it. And I don't want to go into the philosophy of ownership. There's different layers of ownership, but the bottom line is you can give some and keep others. So God keeps some of the ownership, but He gives us some of it as well.
Thank you very much.
So that's for that. Now if anyone has any other comments, questions, go ahead. Otherwise, we move to the Kabbalistic interpretation here. Okay, so we get to the Kabbalistic interpretation, and it goes as follows. Okay, by the way, even before, how do we do this? Okay, let's go to the Kabbalistic interpretation. We're going to discuss it by first, we're going to introduce a verse from Ezekiel, Yecheskel, one of the prophets. And Yecheskel is a fine prophet, but some of his prophecies are very, very harsh. In fact, the verse we're going to quote now is probably the harshest prophecy in all of the Bible. 53, Tez Zion. There is a Ezekiel chapter 16. I'm not telling you to go look at it. It's very, very harsh, to the extent that the Mishnah in Tractate Megillah that tells us which prophecies we read at which time, the Mishnah says we should not read this chapter. It's too harsh. It's too harsh. It talks about how terrible the Jewish people are, and they're like a woman, not just a woman who's promiscuous, but completely promiscuous, and it means the Jewish people are sort of abandoned God. Very, very harsh, harsher than any other prophecy, to the extent that we don't read it even. We don't read it in public. And there it talks about how we're worse. Jerusalem is worse than its neighboring cities, than its sisters. Who are the sisters? Who are the countries that live next to Jerusalem? So you have Shomron. Shomron is Samaria. So Shomron is the 10 tribes of Israel, right? That were exiled, because the 10. Remember that Israel was divided into two because there was 10 tribes seceded from the two tribes. So you had the kingdom of David and the kingdom of Israel. And typically the kingdom of Israel was much more corrupt, and therefore they were exiled earlier, and 10 of those tribes are lost. So that's Samaria. That's one sister of Jerusalem. And the other sister of Jerusalem is Sedom. And the prophet there makes the point that in some ways we are worse than our two sisters. In other words, Judah is worse than the two sisters in the fact that we lost all loyalty to God. But then the end of the Haftarah is always positive. So the end of Haftarah is that when God brings back Samaria and Sedom, then we too will come back to Judah. In other words, the Jewish people will also be rebuilt. Okay, fine. But what does the verse say? What's the takeaway from that verse? The verse says, here you have a verse in the Torah that says, in Ezekiel, it says that God will rebuild and bring back the captive, so to speak, rebuild the cultures of Sedom and its Benotah and her daughters, which basically means the suburbs. Sedom was the metropolitan, and the other cities were its suburbs. So the Kabbalah says, one second, here we have a clear verse that Sedom is going to be rebuilt. So what does this tell us? This tells us that there's a very powerful energy. Okay, there's a very powerful energy in Sedom. Okay, let me stop here. Tell me if tell me if this sounds familiar. Okay, if you ever learned any Kabbalah, tell me if this sounds familiar. There's a very powerful energy. The powerful energy is too powerful, and therefore it causes destruction. And later, the job is we're going to correct the destruction. And when we correct the destruction, we're able to harness that powerful energy that existed to begin with. But now we harness it in a productive way. So you have Sedom. Sedom represents a very powerful energy, but it's so powerful, it destroys, it self-destructs. When things are very powerful, they self-destruct. They have the power to self-destruct. And then there's a break, it shatters. Then our job is to correct the destruction. When we correct the destruction, we're able to harness the energy of Sedom, but to do it in a positive way. That's the story of Sedom. But why is it so Kabbalistic? Because if you remember that one of the basic principles of the Kabbalah is that the way the world was created went through this process. First, you had what they call the lights of Tohu, the lights of chaos, very powerful energy from God. And those energies were so powerful, they self-destruct. Why do they self-destruct? Because we know that there's 10 sefirot, there's 10 divine attributes, there's kindness and there's severity and there's judgment, etc., etc. We have the 10 sefirot. But the 10 sefirot, since each one was so intense, they could not integrate with each other, and they could not coexist. And because they could not coexist, they sort of explode, and they cause destruction, and they break. And when they break, what happens is that this energy falls very low. And from the Kabbalistic perspective, that energy of chaos is the source of all unholiness in the world. And all unholiness in the world is destructive, but it has a tremendous amount of energy. Where does it get all this energy from? It gets all this energy because its source within God is much more powerful, because it's sourced in a higher level, in the lights of chaos. After God projects the lights of chaos, and the lights of chaos break because they self-destruct, then God diminishes the lights, creates what they call the world of tikkun, the world of order. We live in the world of order. Our job is to interact with everything in the world that is the broken vessels from the world of chaos, and to channel that energy in a positive way. So what's really happening here, and I'm going to explain what that means, and for those, you can always elaborate on what that means. So I'm just putting out the Kabbalistic terminology, then we explain. But what's happening, going back to the city of Sedom, that's what happens with Sedom. Sedom has a tremendous amount of energy, but the key feature of the world of Tohu, of chaos, and the reason why chaos ultimately will self-destroy is because it doesn't want to integrate with the other sefirot. The big difference between the world of chaos and the world of order is that the world of chaos, each sefirah, each attribute is self-sufficient. It doesn't want to interact with the other. It doesn't want to give, it doesn't want to take. And I'll explain what that means. So Sedom represents that energy, that intensity. Because each person there has a root in that world of chaos, which the world of chaos feels, I cannot compromise, I cannot give, and I cannot take. So each person in the world of Sedom is separate and independent, and there's no integration. And ultimately, that will lead to self-destruction. And the world of holiness, as we know it today, is all about integration. It's all about interdependence. And interdependence creates the world of order. And once we create the interdependence, then we can go back and harness and collect and correct the energy of the world of chaos and harness it in a positive way. So that's the story in a nutshell. Now all we have to do is elaborate. So what do I mean that in the world of chaos, each sephira, each attribute is so powerful and so intense that it doesn't want to compromise? So I'll give you a few examples. Sometimes a person feels tremendous amount of kindness. This is the examples that we're talking about the last few weeks because of Abraham. If a person is, let's say there's two parents. One parent is kind to the extreme, and the other parent is strict to the extreme. You put them together, there's going to be chaos. It's going to break down because the intent is so intense, they're never going to want to compromise. What does compromise mean? Even though I'm very kind, I have the humility to think about your perspective and realize that in certain cases, I need to be more strict. In certain cases, I need to learn to say no. In certain cases, I need to be able to make boundaries. That is one sephira, one attribute, being willing and open to accept from another attribute. And the same thing is for judgment. The person who's strict, once in a while, has to be able to say, I have to mitigate my severity and strength and allow for kindness. But to do so, remember we said that the world of tikkun, the world of order, the lights have been diminished. That means the energy is diminished. In order to be able to make space for somebody different than you, your intensity, you have to diminish your intensity. And Sedom, they don't want to do that. If I feel kind, I want to feel kind completely. If I feel strength, I want to feel strength completely. And what you're going to get is self-destruction. Now, I don't want to, there's so many areas in life where this plays out. So it's 46, it's already 2 minutes left. So you can go anywhere. But the simple, you have a company, okay? If you have a company and you put 10 people in the room, in the boardroom, and each person has their own way of looking at the world, and each person wants to do what they're doing completely, ultimately the meeting is not going to be productive because every person is pulling in their direction completely without any ability to compromise and to integrate and to take something from the other person's perspective. So one person wants to take risk, and the other, right? You have a business, you have a bank. So you have the risk departments, and then you have the department that's supposed to create profits. And you put them in the boardroom together. And one department says, we're not taking any risk at all. And the risk department says, we're not taking any risk at all. And the investing department says, we'll take all the risk in the world. Now, if each one stands their ground, the company is going to explode. You're not going to be able to do anything. It's ultimately going to self-destruct. What has to happen for order? They have to somehow compromise where they can accommodate some risk, but accommodate some potential, but not forget about all, but not go all the way and accept any risk. In other words, you have to have some balance where each party has to be able to see the value of the other person and together integrate and together create some sort of order. But here's the key. It can only happen when we compromise. And compromising takes humility. And this is only possible because you have to move away from the passion that you have in your own point of view. You have to do what God does. You have to diminish the light. And therefore, Sedom represents the people who don't want to compromise. They don't want to interact. When they don't give a poor person bread, it's not just they don't give him bread. It's like, I'm not giving to you and I'm not taking from you. Every time I give, I'm really taking. There's interdependence. If I give you, then I get something from you as well. I get the satisfaction of helping you, etc. So Sedom represents the reality where each person and each sephira, each perspective is to its extreme. And in some sense, it's more holy because if I'm really kind and I'm closer to my source, then I want to be kind completely, right? Young people are very idealistic. And because they're very idealistic, usually they don't want to compromise. Why not? Because I'm so connected. I'm so connected to what I believe in, I'm going to the extreme. That's the world of chaos. Because extremes in the world of, ultimately, it's going to lead to the breaking of the vessels. What is maturity? Maturity means I have to diminish the emotion a little bit, the intensity of the emotion, and I have to be willing to accept from the other sefirot as well. So according to the world of Kabbalah, in the world of order, each sephira contains all the sefirot. So kindness also contains a little bit of severity, a little bit of judgment. And judgment is willing to accommodate some kindness. And that's how you can create the world of order. So to summarize, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to hear. But to summarize, that's the problem. I don't want to get political. That's the problem with what could be, that's the potential problem with politics. Problem with politics is that because people really believe in what they want on both sides of the aisle, and they for I'm not saying right, wrong, or this, I'm not talking about this election cycle in general. When people really believe in what they want, they think as compromise is a weakness, and compromise is a moral, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a moral, it's
Oh,
moral fault, because here I'm giving up what I really believe in. And the answer is that in the world of order, there has to be interdependence. I have to get from your perspective, you have to get from my perspective. And only when we work in an interdependent way by tuning down some of the passion of the world of chaos, then we can create order. Now, once we create order, now we can go back and channel the passion of the world of chaos, but we're channeling it in a healthy way. Then you can go back and rebuild the Sedom. So that's the story in short. Of course, there's a lot more to say about order and chaos because that's a very fundamental concept in the Kabbalah. It explains so many things. We're not going to have time to do everything today, of course, but I just think it gives a whole nother insight into the world of Sedom and why the Torah is obsessed in some ways with Sedom, because Sedom has a tremendous amount of potential, um, because the power of Sedom represents the power of Tohu. By the way, what does the Kabbalah say? When Mashiach comes, we're going to have, in other words, once you create the world of order, what happens is ultimately the correction comes when you get the light meaning the energy of chaos in the vessels of order. In other words, once we create the world of order and we create healthy vessels, then we could contain some of the passion of the world of chaos. So we have to create the order in order to contain the passion. And therefore, initially, Sedom is shattered. Initially, Sedom is destroyed. But ultimately, when Mashiach comes, we're going to rebuild Sedom because we're going to have the proper vessels to be able to contain the energy of Sedom. So this is the idea in a nutshell. Of course, it has to be elaborated upon, but I think for this morning, just to give us a little taste of what's happening here, I think this would be sufficient for now. May God give us many years to continue studying the Torah in good health and in happiness.
Amen.
thank you, Rabbi. I have a quick question
Yeah.
though. Did Abraham understand? Are you here, Rabbi?
I'm here, yeah.
Okay. When Abraham tried to defend Sodom, did it come from the place of appreciating the value of the energy?
Well, if you ask the Kabbalist will say yes. Of course, every story is true on on many dimensions. The simple level, the answer is no. He's just kind to people, and therefore he doesn't want destruction. But the Kabbalist will insist, yes, when Abraham says we have to save Sodom, it's because he understands the tremendous potential that lie within Sodom. The problem is that ultimately, even he has to concede that just because the energy is intense, the energy, unless they're going to have the humility of the world of order to compromise and be interdependent, what's going to happen is that there's going to be destruction, and you can't save yourself, because if you have that amount of intensity in one room, it's going to explode. Now, just to come full circle with our discussion earlier, the whole idea of I have private property and I choose to share, that's an idea of interdependency. It's mine and I give you, and you give me. Because if I give you cash, you give me the satisfaction of being a giver. So the Talmud says, more than the giver gives to the recipient gives to the giver, right? So when you're giving, there's also always interdependence. And Sedom did not like this interdependency. Why? Because it's the world of chaos. The world of chaos is intense independence, because since I am so connected to my source, I'm so connected to my own energy, I don't want to make space for any other energy. And it comes from a good place. It comes from a very high place. But in the real world, you have to diminish your own energy to be able to interact with other people, create a society, create the worlds of order, and then you can hopefully begin to channel that energy in the vessels of order. So again, it's a big subject. It's a big, what they call a sugya. It's a big subject, but This is an interesting angle, interesting approach to that subject.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zena.